His host, so he'll press record.
Yeah, we are recording.
Yes. Right, it looks as if we've got it all in place.
Perfect.
So I just have to start with some excuses this afternoon, really. Firstly, to thank everyone who has made comments on my paper on the forum, and then to say that I would like to respond to all of them, and I haven't done so because I want to respond thoughtfully, and I just haven't had the time to do that. So I really look forward to engaging more with your questions and comments on the forum. And the other excuse is just to say that some of you might have heard my initial thinking on these matters already in 2016. So for some of you, it wouldn't be new coming from me, but I hope that this is an opportunity to take those initial thoughts further. And if you'll just all bear with me as someone who has been dealing with the technicalities as well. So yeah, I'm getting worse and worse at multitasking, I'm afraid. So let me get into it then. My reading of the ayat in the Quran came from me as a Christian trying to read the Quran on its own terms. In trying to understand how the Quran presents itself to an audience that established a community, it made me think of scripture as a persuasive text. How does the text elicit the commitment of a community, or at least represent the formation of a community that professes belief in it? And so the ayat came to the fore as not only a theme of the Quran, but also as its form. Sign is the form of the Quran, with each verse referred to as a sign, and sign is its content or the substance of revelation, as Sayyid Ahmad Khan would have said, as we heard yesterday. But the Quran does not present sign in a doctrinal or a disembodied way. It sets itself firmly in the world of the audience by pointing to material elements in the world. So Ida's question in the prolegomenon of the relationship between the form of the text and its content and intent was really what shaped my own investigation as well. The form of its persuasion, of the Quran's persuasion, is initially reminiscent of pre-Islamic form in using the images and the structures of the cultural expressions of its first audience, such as the oath clusters or the rhetorical questions, as I pointed out in my paper, that were frequent in the earliest passages. And then also another feature is the opening verses, or in Arabic called the nasib, which often provide the image that eventually becomes the title of the chapter. So through the use of this combination of rhetorical questions and the oath clusters and the nasib, these forms and substances are given meaning by being put within a frame of the announcement of a day of judgment. And so the running steeds and the break of day, the sun, moon, and the earthquake, and even time itself are set into a new horizon that expects accountability from the one who had created all of these in the first place. But it's not only nature that is a sign for the Quran. The life of the community itself is a sign. The history and the narratives of its peoples are a sign. And so we find the Quraysh, the people of the elephant, the Roman Empire, are all held up as examples of divine action in the world. Not only are these political entities significant, but also the ethical actions of individuals and groups. And perhaps you want to open up your Qur'ans and your Bibles. I don't have slides of all the texts that I'm referring to. And the one that I'm going to refer to now is Surah 107, Surah Al-Ma'un, which holds up the one who repulses the orphan or denies food to the needy as an example of those who deny the day of judgment. So although we don't have the term ayat here, this individual, an unnamed individual, who repulses the orphan and who denies food to the needy, is held up as an exemplar of those who deny the day of judgment. Yet very early on, the Qur'an registers the audience's engagement with its contents. And so we find in Surah 109, Surah Al-Kafirun, that it indicates disagreement with a group about the substance of worship. I do not worship that which you worship, and that this may very well remain a static condition because the chapter ends by saying, to you be your way and to me mine. There is also the indication of disagreement with individuals. As I pointed out in my paper in Surah 111, Surah Al-Masad, we have Abu Lahab, whose wealth will prove to be of no help or a guarantee to him in the afterlife, together with his wife, who is supposedly complicit in this opposition, and both will suffer alongside each other in the afterlife. So individuals within other faiths also become, sorry, I keep moving on to a text before my time. Individuals within other faiths are also registered as opposition. So for instance, in Surah 98, when the people of the book are linked with the polytheists as rejectors, as kafirun, until they receive clear signs, which Surah 109 says is a messenger from God, a Rasul, rehearsing pure or holy texts within which are writings, or kutubun, the Arabic word kutubun. These are the religious establishment of the Qur'an's context, who perhaps contest its message most strongly compared to others, so that humanity in its whole become a sign for the Qur'an. Now I'm getting to the right slide. So we see in Surah 30 that all of humanity becomes a sign, an ayat. Verse 20, among his signs is this, he creates you out of dust, and then lo, you become human beings ranging far and wide, right from creation. The male and female mates that were created for each other become a sign. And ultimately, the creation of heaven and earth, the diversity of your tongues and the colors of peoples, for in this, behold, there are signs for all who have knowledge. But then how does this persuade the audience? Allegiance to the message and the messenger is presumed in Surah 60, especially Surah 60 is the Surah of Mumtahina, the women to be tested, or also sometimes called Surah Al-Muhajirat, women who emigrate. When believing women approach the messenger to swear an oath of allegiance, the women are to be tested, and they're also described as women who have emigrated to the community. These women's response provide the opportunity for the Qur'an to set out its fundamental ethical principles. And so the oath of allegiance that they swear is not to associate any with God, not to steal, not to commit unlawful sexual intercourse, not to kill their children, not to slander, and to obey the Prophet in all things. And here we then see a response to the Qur'an's message, or to the form and the content of the message with people who are emigrating towards the message. But the clearest form of engagement that I found with the messenger and the message, or the form and the substance of the Qur'an, for me was in Surah 58, or the Surah of the Mujadila, the chapter of her who disputes. Here we have a very elusive introduction in the first 6 verses that present a woman in oppositional terms to the messenger, disputing and carrying her plea to God. From a purely literary perspective, in other words, what I'm not doing is looking at the narrative that was developed in Islamic traditional material, but purely just from what we have here in the Quran. We have an extraordinary moment of the audience engaging the teachings of the messenger, applying the message that they have absorbed up to now, in approaching the messenger to adjudicate on their behalf, and reflecting it back in a posture of disputation or a plea that assumes that God hears. It assumes God's omnipresence in carrying her complaint to God. She provides an opportunity for the text to declare that God hears both sides and to reveal that God is all-hearing and all-seeing. And he sends down this revelation on this occasion. In this way, the Mujadila, the debating woman, becomes a Quranic sign, an ayat. She is one of the images or sound figures for the oral text that makes up the matrix of images, eventually coalescing into the one sign of the book, as Angelica Neuwirth puts it. The Quran thus sets up types of examples to emulate, but also records types that are not convinced of its message. The mushrikun and mushrikat, the polytheists, the munafiqun, munafiqat, the hypocrites, the kafirun, kafirat, the rejectors, are a constant presence throughout the Quran. When the Quran thus proclaims that it presents clear signs, it seems to indicate that there are some who will never be convinced and who will remain not only unpersuaded, but perhaps even active in their opposition. The Quran as sign, as corpus, thus presents a sign that calls for deeper reflection. For some, it is to be emulated, and for some, it continues to be an unpersuasive text. The warnings about a day of judgment provides the framework for the reader or the reciter to identify with these categories of response. This relationship between the Quran's substance of sign and form of sign helped me to reflect on the way that the Gospel, according to John, presents sign as a significant theme. In the light of the Quran's linking of form, content, and the recording of the audience response, I considered the extent to which the Gospel presents Samaya explicitly as a form, that brings a message, while also recording the audience response. As we had in the papers on Mary this morning, these presentations are not only about the protagonists in the text, but also about the kind of community that it is establishing. The 7 signs that John selects is one of the elements that put it in a different category to the Synoptic Gospels. Sorry, just want to get to the 7 signs. So one could say that it assumes all the miracle works of the Synoptic Gospels, bringing the work and sayings of Jesus together as types that allude to the other writings. These 7 signs are also combined with 7 sayings, which I didn't address in my paper, sometimes referred to as the I am sayings, where Jesus provides more of a discourse around the miracles, how each explicates him, his character, and his nature together with his miracle work. One of the ways that we might be able to understand this is when we think about the way that characters are portrayed in films, especially historical films. And I'm reminded of one of our lockdown activities with my 2 sons was to watch the series Chernobyl. In the drama, I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but the actress Emily Watson plays a scientist, Uliana Komyuk. She's a nuclear physicist from Minsk, And at the end of the series, there were the usual pictures of the real people who were portrayed in the film and updates of what had happened to the people in the film, who were obviously portrayed by actors, but then of course you see the pictures of the real people with these updates. When it came to the scientists that did all the investigations, Uljanja Komjuk, there was a picture of the actress and an explanation that she's a composite character who is based on the many scientists who had investigated the accident in Chernobyl. In other words, she is a fictional character that brings together the historical facts and the personalities that were essential to the narrative. So here is then where we can see some of the distinctions or the differences between the form and the substance of sign in the Qur'an and the Gospel of John, where John presents the signs in a narrative that is contained within itself. Yes, for a full theological understanding, one needs the complete Bible, the other Gospels, the prophecies, the historical narratives, and the other writings. But the Gospel provides a coherent narrative that draws together the messianic expectations of the Old Testament prophets with the acts of God, and it places them within a setting that clarifies Jesus' sayings. In this way, the text calls for a response to further investigate, while also showing that the first audience grappled with the meaning of the person and work of Christ. It presents characters with whom one may identify or with whom one differs. It presents the actions of Jesus within the expectation of a larger framework of prophetic announcements and writings. And so we have these different characters who might be representative of people who understand, people who question, people who indeed believe, and people who remain unconvinced. And so for the reader then, one may continue to investigate and perhaps even become convinced as one sees it within the descriptions of John, the narrative of John, that places these characters within their settings, often moving from darkness into light or from illness into healing, showing his power over water, showing how he is the bread of life, just as the manna in the desert was the bread of life. And if you want to include the miracle of the fish after the resurrection, how he provides food and is himself the sign of Jonah, and eventually also the true vine. And that concludes my presentation.
That is great. Thank you so much, Georgina. As always, we have the clap icon. It's a fun thing to use. And you actually saved yourself 20 minutes. So now we have 5 minutes for questions of clarifications. If anybody has any question, please put up your hand. And I will see. Okay, I see Sama. Hannah has a question. Let me unmute you.
Yes. Sorry, Shireen, I was just clapping. Sorry.
Oh, you were just clapping. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Let me mute you again, or you can mute yourself. Anybody who has a question? I'm going through the list.
Can I ask a question? I haven't got an app.
Yes, Ida, and then after you, it will be Danny Crowthers. So first, Ida.
What's the implication of your composite fictional character that John's Jesus is a composite fictional character, or were you doing something else with that?
Perhaps to a certain extent. So there's the signs that Jesus, I wouldn't say Jesus as character is a composite but certainly the signs might be composite. So, for instance, John only selects 2 healings. And if we look at the other synoptic gospels, there are many other healings that take place. And the walking on the water, there are other events where Jesus also shows his power and control of water, for instance, when he calms the storms in the synoptic gospels. So John is very selective in the miracle works that he chose. And so in that sense, the actual works and the sayings we can think of as composite, and not the character as such, but the works and the sayings of Jesus.
Does that answer your question, Ida?
Yes, yes.
Yes, great. Because we have a bit of time, so we could potentially go a little bit more into it if you need it. So Danny Crowder, your turn. Yes.
Great. Yeah. No. Thank you, Georgina. I love the concept of signs and a similar thing. So my question really is, I think when it says a sign in the Quran, the ayat are clear. It's a sign of. What is the sign of? And it's explained. But what is it? These miracles? What are these signs of in John's Gospel? Is this meant to be a mystery, or is it obvious? And yeah.
Yes. So I would certainly say that in John, it's made very obvious because it's tied to a narrative. So that it's not. It's meant to clarify the mystery, although some people still misunderstand. The role of metaphor is often that you're presented with an incongruity. Now, some people might be persuaded by Jesus's description of himself as bread of life. Some might not. And then, of course, some of the religious establishment took that to some of it to be even blasphemous.
So it's a sign of, they're signs of Jesus, not of, they're signs of who Jesus is. Is that what the signs are?
Yes, absolutely. So that is the whole point of what John is trying to make clear, is that the signs and the sayings show us who Jesus is, the nature and the character of Jesus, whereas the signs that we find in the Quran is showing us what the Quran is, in a sense. It is it points to the spiritual or the transcendent reality behind the material world, of which the Quran itself is a sign.
Could I'll just push you, if I may, could it be that in the Quran the sign is, part of the sign is the sign of the message of the Prophet, a sign that the message of the Prophet is correct, whereas the sign in the Gospel is a sign of who the messenger is? Is that a wrong? I'm making it. I'm just firing off the top of my head. I'm just responding. What have I heard correctly?
Yes, I would say you've heard correctly. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Danny, for your question. The last question for clarification is from Andy.
Hi, Georgina. Earlier in your paper, you talked about the multiple meanings of the word ayah. On the one hand, if I may categorize them in my way, we have things in nature and miracles, which are visible things. They're events. On the other hand, there's this special use of ayah to refer to a verse of the Quran. And of course, that word, Arabic word ayah, has Hebrew and Syriac cognates with the same sort of range of meaning, and the Greek word semeion as well that you've mentioned. But I don't find in any of those, the Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, or Greek words, this use of that word, whether it be the ayah cognate or the word semeion, to refer to an utterance in the sense of like a verse of the Quran. So I wonder if we know where that shift of meaning happened. I know that there are verses in the Quran that people will take as referring to the verse, but I don't think that those are unambiguous. I think they could be understood as referring to the first two categories of meaning, natural events or miracles. So it seems to me that that shift of meaning of the word ayah to include the meaning of utterance or a verse of the Quran may have come later. Do we have any evidence of that?
So in terms of if you're looking for a specific shift in the Quran, I would say that it's all this idea of the matrix of images that Neubert speaks of builds up to the Quran, into the singular sign of the Quran as book, which of course the Quran is a recitation. And then if one takes it back again to the origins of the first revelation, which is a recitation or an utterance, it becomes part of the language of sign, and it's inferred to that first event, even while the first event doesn't use the technical terminology of ayat or sign. You know, there's no, the revelation doesn't say, here is a sign, now recite. It says recite, and that in and of itself becomes the sign. And so I would think that is why the Islamic narrative of prophethood develops around the idea that the Quran is the miracle that is delivered by the prophet, the utterance.
Are you saying that in a similar way that in the Old Testament, the temple is destroyed, and so the Torah becomes the locus of spirituality, and then under the New Covenant, something similar happens, that text for certain groups takes on characteristics that were held by something visible, that here we're saying that something visible and tangible, a sign, that's then being reinterpreted and applied to text.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. I'll take that, Andy, and you might see it in my eventual paper.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that was great. Thank you again, Georgina, for your fascinating paper and presentation. Now we move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Abdullah Galadari. He is a professor, assistant professor of humanities and social sciences at the Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi, and he's now connecting to us from Dubai. So I hand over to you, Abdullah. And again, you have 40 minutes for your presentation and 5 minutes for clarification discussions.
Well, thank you very much. I will be sharing my presentation. So hopefully you can see the full presentation.
Yes, we can see it. It's great.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'll be talking about the Quran and the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke, and looking into perhaps some of the motifs that are shared in the parable with some passages of the Quran. So the Quran appears to be well aware of some of the Gospel parables, especially the ones from the Synoptic Gospels. And the closest direct quotation is the parable of the camel passing through the eye of the needle, in which the Quran almost quotes verbatim. And also the parable phraseology of the Quran also has a lot of close resemblances to that of the Gospels. Imran al-Badawi, for example, in his book has showed how some of that phraseology is very similar to the Aramaic Gospels. So basically, when we want to talk about the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, perhaps it would be ideal to inform some of us who are not very familiar with the parable. But the parable, generally speaking, talks about a rich man who was living in luxury life. And at his gate, there was a beggar by the name of Lazarus. They both die, and Lazarus goes to the bosom of Abraham, whereas the rich man is in torment. And while the rich man is in torment, he looks up for Abraham and asks Abraham to have pity on him and to send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water to cool the rich man's tongue. because he's in agony. However, Abraham basically rejects that and says that in your lifetime, the rich man's lifetime, you received many good things, whereas Lazarus did not. So he's now comforted while you are in torment. And in any case, there is a chasm, there is a great chasm between Abraham and Lazarus with the rich man. So there's this chasm, which means that this water that he's asking for would not be allowed to be given. So in any case, the rich man then later asks Abraham, well, then let's Lazarus please go back to his family. He has so many brothers. So go back to his family and warn them. Then Abraham simply responds and says, well, your brothers, your family, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. But the rich man responds, well, but it's going to be different if a dead person goes back to life and warns them. And then Abraham still refuses and says, well, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they will never even be convinced if someone also rises from the dead. So this is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And while the Quran does not use any aspect of this parable verbatim, as it does, for example, with the parable of the camel passing through the eye of the needle, there does seem to be some similarities with at least some motifs in the Quran. And the main motif that I would like to be discussing is basically the concept of the barrier or the chasm. So in the Quran, there is a concept of what is known as the barzakh, which is understood as the barrier between the realms of the dead and the living, in which no one can cross over. So in other words, nobody from the dead can be brought back to the realm of the living. So there is this concept of the barzakh, the concept of a barrier that exists. Yet the concept of the barrier does not only exist in the Quran between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living, but also between those who are generally in heaven and those who are in hell. So basically, this concept appears to be somewhat similar to the concept of the chasm in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And as we will see, that the Quran uses, chooses to use certain aspects from the parable, such as the water being brought up to from heaven to hell, for example, or people returning back from the dead to the living. So we will see that the Quran actually uses some aspects from this parable in different passages. So, so while the Quran directly engages with some of the gospel traditions on this parable, it does not actually use it verbatim. And also, interestingly, that the 3 times that the Quran uses the concept of a barrier, it uses 3 completely different terms. So it's not even the same term that the Quran uses in those 3 different instances, where we see some parallels with the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. This basically tells us that perhaps the Quran is using a common motif from traditions that existed during the late antiquity that perhaps extrapolated those ideas from the parable. So maybe the Quran is not directly engaging with the parable itself from the Gospel of Luke, but it might be actually engaging with different sources, different traditions that themselves extrapolate those ideas from the parable. So there might be an indirect way that the Quran is actually engaging with this parable. And that is what I argue in my paper. So the concept of the barzakh, to understand the concept of the barzakh in the Quran actually speaks of the barzakh in 3 different instances, but only in one instance does it speak about it in terms of a barrier between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living. It basically says, till when death comes to one of them, he says, my Lord, return me, that haply I may work righteousness with regard to that which I left. Nay, indeed, these are words that he speaks, and behind them is a barrier, a barzakh, till the day they are resurrected. So what exactly is this barzakh? What is the meaning of the barzakh? Well, interestingly, Muslim commentators do not have a consensus exactly of what is the barzakh, what is the clear definition of a barzakh. So there is no consensus. It appears to be a barrier between two things. It exists, the term exists in 3 different passages in the Quran. Once talking about this barrier between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living, and twice it is used as a barrier between 2 different kinds of seas, the salty sea and the sweet sea. So otherwise, it doesn't actually exist in any other place in the Quran besides those 3 instances. The term barzakh appears not to be of Semitic origin. Actually, it is most likely to be of a Persian origin, which conjoins 2 words, borzakhu. Borz coming from the Old Persian and Middle Persian, meaning high. Actually, even if you go to Iran today, you will find that there is a mountain range that is called Al-Borz, and Al-Borz meaning the high, and it is basically used as a term in the Zoroastrian Avestas. So Borz means high, and Ahu means existence. So therefore, Borzakhu would mean a high plane or a high plane of existence. It can be completely contrasted with another term in Persian, which is Durzakh. And Durzakh actually means the evil plane of existence, or in other words, hell. And the Zoroastrian Avesta actually uses the term Durzakh to mean hell. Now, interestingly, however, even though Burzakh would be fully in contrast with Durzakh, it is not used to mean heaven in the Zoroastrian Avesta. So in the Zoroastrian Avesta, heaven is actually called Bihisht. It's not called Burzakh. So therefore, it wouldn't be the best translation of heaven, even though it is in contrast with Durzakh. So therefore, it could simply mean it's a high plane of existence, perhaps a wall, a high wall, which in other words simply means it's a barrier. So it's just a barrier, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's heaven as a high form of existence. It's just that it is a high place. It's some kind of a barrier, a wall, in other words. Well, in classical Muslim commentators, there is differences of ideas of also what this concept of a wall that exists between heaven and hell. So basically, we can see that if we do define barzakh as a barrier, it will actually reveal some parallels with 2 other passages in the Quran. One of them is Quran 57:13, which basically talks about a barrier between those in heaven and those in hell. It actually says, on the day when the hypocrites, men and women, will say to those who believe, wait for us that we may borrow from your light. It will be said, turn back and seek a light. Thereupon a wall with a gate will be set down between them, the inner side of which contains mercy and the outer side of which lies punishment. So here we see this kind of imagery of a wall that exists between heaven and hell, between those in torment and those in, under mercy. Now, when we compare some of the terminologies of Quran 57:13 with Quran 23:99-100, which discusses the barzakh as a barrier between those in the realm of the dead and the realm of the living, we see that it also uses some terms that are in parallel to Quran 57. For example, it uses the word return me, similar to Quran 57, which says turn. And it also uses the word behind them, wara'ihim, which is similar to how Quran 57:13 also says wara'akum, back. So there are these similar terminologies used, which therefore perhaps allows us to understand that barzakh could simply be that wall that is set between those who are in torment and those who are under the mercy. Actually, classical Muslim commentators also suggest that the barrier between those in heaven and hell mentioned in Quran 57:13 is in parallel with what is mentioned in Quran 7:44-51. Now, what is interesting why we want to mention Quran 7 as well is because Quran 7 is the chapter of the Quran that actually quotes almost verbatim the parable of the camel passing through the eye of the needle, which therefore tells us that Quran 7 appears to be very well aware of some of the parables of the gospel. And Quran 7, 44, 51 is actually within the direct context of the parable of the camel passing through the eye of the needle. In any case, Quran 7, 44, 51 also talks about some sort of a barrier, that there is some kind of covering, there's some sort of a veil, and there is this barrier which it calls Al-Araf, or in other words, it is usually translated as the heights. So Al-Araf, which simply means the heights, and it is understood by classical Muslim commentators as the wall that is mentioned in Quran 57:13. Now, as you could see, in this chapter, it uses the word heights, or Al-Araf in Arabic. In Quran 57:13, it uses the term for wall or a fence, which is sur in Arabic. And then in Quran 23, it uses the term barzakh for this barrier. So in each time it talks about this kind of barrier between heaven and hell, or a barrier between the realms of the living and the realm of the dead, it uses completely different terminologies. It never uses the same terminology. Yet still we see that in Quran 7, when it talks about this barrier, it calls it Al-Araf, it calls it a height. And if we understand the etymology of the barzakh, if it comes really from the Persian burzakh, then burz actually means the height, it means a high place. Now, what is interesting also in Quran 7, 44, 51, where we have this kind of barrier between heaven and hell, we also find that the people are actually asking, the people in hell who are in torment are asking the people in heaven to pour some water down upon them. And it also is rejected. So something very similar as we also see in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Now, the idea of the abode of the dead is not something unique in Islam. It actually exists in Second Temple Judaism, where it does call it the bosom of Abraham. It is the same kind of imagery that the New Testament also uses in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Now, what is interesting is that we do see some parallels of the rich man and Lazarus, though not directly, but indirectly, we do see some of those parallels in those three different passages of the Quran. So in Quran 23, 9900, Quran 57, 17, and Quran 7, 41, 46. And I will show you later on a summary of how some of the parts of the rich man and Lazarus actually parallels some of these passages, but the lowest common denominator between all of those three passages is the concept of the barrier, or the chasm, in other words, that exists between those who are in torment and those who are under the mercy of God, or also between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. So basically, that is the lowest common denominator. It's the barrier between heaven and hell. So in Quran 57, for example, as well as in Quran 7, we have this concept of a barrier that exists between heaven and hell, very similar to the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And we also find in Quran 750, which basically the people in hell asking the people in heaven to pour some water on them, and it was rejected. So their request was rejected, similar to the request done by the rich man in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Another concept that is also similar is the inability to return back to the abode of the living. So Quran 23, 99, 100, for example, states that someone dies and requests to be returned back to this life. But the answer basically implies that the dead cannot return back to this life in order to change their deeds or to change their actions. Similarly, in Quran 7, 52, 53, also it suggests that God has sent books and messengers to warn the people, but they did not heed them. And then they asked to be returned back to this life in order to change their deeds and live a more righteous life. So here we also find a concept of that the people request or want to return back to this life in order to change their deeds. Yet in Quran 7:52-53, what is even very important to keep in mind is that it actually says that God has sent books and messengers to warn the people, and yet they did not heed them, and then they asked to be returned. Now, what is interesting in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, we also find that kind of a concept in which the rich man asks Abraham to send Lazarus to his family and warn his family. But Abraham responds by saying, well, they already have Moses and the prophets. And if they do not believe in them, then they will not even believe if someone rises from the dead. So here it seems that Abraham responds that, well, they already have Moses and the prophets. So in other words, it seems that in Quran 7:52-53, it has this notion that God has already sent books and messengers to warn the people, and yet they still feel that they better go back, once they're dead, they want to go back and return to this life and change their deeds. So we do see that these concepts are a little bit in parallel. So to summarize some of those parallels between the parable of the rich man and the Quran, and we will see that in the Quran, it's actually in different instances, in 3 different passages of the Quran. And in each of those 3 passages of the Quran, it uses a completely different term for a barrier. So one of them is basically the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Basically, wealth in this world is considered worthless compared to the reward in heaven. And in Quran 57:20, also it says that wealth in this world is worthless compared to the reward in heaven. Actually, Quran 7, chapter 7, which holds another part of the some similarities with the gospel of with the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in the Gospel of Luke. Also, the chapter's main message is that this worldly life is worthless, and the hereafter is what is needed to be strived for. So another thing, the second thing is that exists is that there is a chasm between those in heaven and hell, and also in Quran 57:13, for example, there is this chasm between those in heaven and hell. But that's not only in Quran 57:13, you find it also in Quran 7, also in Quran 23. There is this concept of a chasm, this concept of a barrier. The third thing is the rich man asks Abraham to send Lazarus with water, but is refused. And it's the same thing that we find in Quran 7:50, where the people in hell ask for water, but it is refused. After requesting water, the rich man is reminded of the good things he had in this life, having lived a life of luxury. And in Quran 7:51, after requesting water, after the people in hell request water, they are reminded that they actually had forgotten God and have been deluded with this worldly life. And another parallel that we could see is that the rich man asks that Lazarus returns back to this life to warn his brothers, but is refused. And the same we can actually see in Quran 23, 99 and 100. So in another passage of the Quran, that the dead person asks to be returned to this life, but is refused. And after requesting that Lazarus is returned back to life to warn his family, Abraham states that, well, they already have Moses and the prophets. And the same thing that, as I just discussed a little while ago, that God, in Quran 7:52-53, it says that God sent books and messengers to warn people, and yet they want to return back to life to change their deeds. So we basically see many of these parallels in 3 different passages of the Quran. So not the same passage, but in 3 different passages of the Quran. And that is why I argue that it is most likely the Quran is not using the parable of the rich man and Lazarus directly, but perhaps indirectly in 3 different places. So indirectly, meaning that maybe the Quran is using a motif that itself is in late antiquity, that itself is rooted in the Gospel of Luke's parable of the rich man and Lazarus. So the concept of the chasm in the Bible, well, interestingly, the Greek term of chasma used in Luke 16:26 is actually a hapax legomenon, and it simply means like a wide opening. right? It's not otherwise used in the New Testament. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, uses it also just once to translate the Hebrew term pahat. But pahat also in Hebrew has not always been translated as chasma in Greek. In the Septuagint, it was sometimes translated as bothenos or themos. So it's not always translated. So even in the Septuagint, we also find chasma as a hapax legomenon as well, only used once for the Hebrew pahat, which simply means a great pit or a large abyss. The Aramaic Peshitta, for example, translates the chasma in Luke 16:26 as hauta, which actually means a deep abyss, and it is cognate to the Quranic term hawiya. So the Aramaic hauta is cognate to the Arabic hawiya. The Quran uses the term hawiya mainly as another name for hell, but hawiya actually literally means a deep abyss, a very large, big pit. So that is what the literal term actually means. Now, if we try to understand, okay, well, what is the relationship between the barzakh in the Quran when it uses it as a barrier between the abode of the living and the abode of the dead, when it is also being used in the Quran twice as a barrier between two seas. So maybe if we try to understand what it means when it is used between two seas as a barrier, we may better understand what it actually means as a barrier between the abode of the dead and the living. Or the between two different types of seas. In one of those passages, it says, "And he it is who maraj the two seas." And I'm using the term maraj. It is mostly understood as mixing, but I'm not going to use the translation mixing in here. And I will show you in a little while why I basically do not want to use the term mix for the term maraj in Arabic. In any case, it says, "And he it is who maraj the two seas, one sweet, satisfying, and the other salty, bitter, and set between them a barzakh," this kind of barrier, "and a girded guard." So we've got this concept again of this barzakh. Another passage in the Quran says that he maraj, again, I don't want to translate it as mixing, but he maraj the two seas such that they meet one another, but between them lies a barzakh that they transgress not. Now, what exactly is the word maraj? What does it really mean? Now, although it is usually understood as mixing, we can actually see that in those two passages, it does not necessarily mean mixing. Why? Well, because the Quran appears to say, well, it is maraj, those two seas, they meet, but there is a barrier between them. And if there is a barrier between them, it means that maraj would not really mean, therefore, mixing. So what other possibilities would maraj mean? Well, there is another definition for the term maraj, which actually means an expanse of land. And it is especially used for open fields for grazing flocks. For example, in Arabic, the plural of an open field would be like muruj, which is coming from the root maraj. It's an open land, an expanse of land. So perhaps even in Aramaic, it has the same idea, is that it could be this kind of expanse of land. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the two seas are mixing. Well, why is it a problem if we try to translate it or understand maraj as mixing instead of as an expanse of land, or in other words, as a chasm as well? Well, one of the reasons is that while those two seas meet according to those two passages, they don't really mix. Not only do they not really mix, but they don't also transgress against one another. So one of the passages says that la yabghiyan, they don't transgress with one another. So even though they meet, they don't even transgress against each other. They don't, not only do they not mix, but they don't totter against each other. They don't touch each other. Why? Because there is this barzakh between them, this concept of a chasm between them. Well, what could that possibly mean? I'm not going to go delve into what the those two passages about the two types of seas, because I don't want to go beyond what I want to take out of it, which is understanding the idea or the concept of barzakh. But perhaps the concept of the two seas, one salty and the other is sweet, could actually go back to perhaps from Genesis 1, where there are two waters, right? The waters below and the waters above. And there's a firmament, according to Genesis 1, that is in place in order to separate the waters below from the waters above. Now, the whole idea of Genesis 1 itself goes back to Sumerian and Akkadian myths. And in the Sumerian and Akkadian myths, we actually find more about these two different waters that are separated. And actually, we perhaps find that the Quran perhaps seems to take the concept of the sweet water and the salty water from the Sumerian and Akkadian myths. Because according to the Sumerian and Akkadian myths, there is the concept of the god Abzu and the goddess Tiamat. Abzu is the god symbolizing sweet water, and Tiamat is the goddess of symbolized by salty water. And according to the Sumerian and Akkadian myths, it's when they both actually not only meet, but when they both actually have conjugal relations, that is how the whole world was created. So it's when the sweet water and the salt water, or Abzu and Tiamat, when they came together, that is when the whole universe was created, according to the Sumerian and Akkadian myths. So perhaps we can see when the Quran uses the two different types of seas, this kind of concept of Abzu and Tiamat perhaps comes up into the picture. In any case, what is more important is understanding the concept of barzakh as a barrier. This barzakh means that those two seas are not mixing with each other. Not only are they not mixing, but they're not even touching each other. They're not transgressing each other. Because it basically, one of the passages says that la yabghiyan, they don't transgress against each other. Now the root baghaya has similarities in the semantic domains in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. It also means to seek, to inquire as well. So not only does it mean to transgress in Arabic, but it could also mean to seek and to inquire. And the Quran uses the word baghaya in that sense as well. Actually, I will show you where it actually gives you that. So basically, in the concept of two seas, it is interesting that there's another passage in the Quran which speaks of two seas, sweet and salty. So it says, not equal are the two seas, one sweet, satisfying, pleasant to drink, and the other salty, bitter. Yet from each you eat fresh meat and bring out ornaments that you wear. And you see the ships therein plowing through, that you may seek, litabtaghu. And in here, the term to seek is the same root. It's the same term using this root baghaya, which the other passage of the Quran says that when the two seas meet, they do not transgress, la yabghiyan, they don't transgress against each other. So here we also see that the Quran sometimes is using those terminologies in a very specific way in order to have these kind of inner Quranic allusions towards one another. So, what is this barzakh, or what is this barrier? Whether it is the barzakh in Quran 23, the barrier between the abode of the living and the abode of the dead, or if it is this barrier between heaven and hell, which is called Sur in Quran 57:13, or it is called Al-Araf in chapter 7. Actually, the whole chapter 7 in Arabic is called Al-Araf. It is called the heights because it is called after this barrier which exists between those in heaven and those in hell. So is it a metaphor that the Quran is using, perhaps from the parable of the rich man and Lazarus? So is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus a subtext, and it is this kind of concept that the Quran is using? Well, it seems that perhaps the Quran is understanding and using it as a parable, very much like the rich man and Lazarus, meaning that it doesn't necessarily mean it is something historic. Because, for example, in Quran 23 or in Quran 7 or in Quran 57, it is never understood as something historic. It is actually understood as something that perhaps will happen eschatologically. So it is not something historic. So it could happen eschatologically. It could simply be a parable. Or in other words, it just could be a metaphor, very much as it is in the rich man and Lazarus, meaning that the parable of the rich man and Lazarus need not to necessarily be taken as something literal or as something that is not metaphoric. But who knows? I mean, is it metaphoric or is it not metaphoric? That is still up in the air. So in conclusion, while the Quran does not directly refer to the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, it does appear to use certain motifs of the parable in different parts of the Quran, in 3 separate passages of the Quran. And in each one of those passages of the Quran, it uses completely different terms for the barrier. And that is why I believe most likely that the Quran is not directly taking these motifs directly from the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, but perhaps there exists some other traditions in late antiquity in which itself have basically taken some of the motifs from the rich man and Lazarus parable that the Quran is actually engaging with. So perhaps the Quran is engaging with these other traditions who themselves have taken certain motifs from the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Of course, there is no way to know for sure, but the reason why I lean more towards that is because unlike, for example, the parable of the camel passing through the eye of the needle, which exists verbatim in the Quran or almost verbatim in the Quran, and within only one single passage in the Quran. And in here we see that we find some parallels between the rich man, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, in 3 separate Quranic passages, and it's not always the same. So some of the things you will find in one passage of the Quran that you wouldn't find in the other. The only common denominator, as I said, is the concept of a barrier, this chasm. But otherwise, we find in different parts or different passages, different motifs of the rich man and Lazarus. So it's not a single one. And also, the Quran is using completely different terminologies in each passage. So perhaps it seems more likely that the Quran is not directly engaging this from the Gospel of Luke on the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, but perhaps it is actually from other kinds of traditions that existed in late antiquity. So, well, that's that. Thank you all very much for your very kind attention.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. That was really fascinating. Excellent presentation. Thank you. And you are again spot on time. That leaves us with 5 minutes for minor questions regarding just clarifications. And then after that, we can enter the discussion. So if anybody has any questions, I can see Carol has raised her hand. So you can unmute yourself, Carol, and please go ahead.
Thank you. That was really very interesting, very fascinating, lovely interweaving. So I just my need probably to change my own thinking. I learnt that Bahrain is named after 2 waters, and that is about not it being a promontory with water on either side, but if you dive down, there is sweet water underneath and salt water on top. And I just wondered whether you are now cast aside that has any referencing in the Quran for me, or not?
Well, thank you very much, Carol, for this wonderful question, actually. What is interesting, many people don't realize, but according to Sumerians, they say that they originally came from a place called Dilmun. And nobody really knows exactly where Dilmun is. But there are some archaeologists who believe that Bahrain is the place where the Dilmun civilization existed and is the actual birthplace of the Sumerian people. Nobody knows for sure, but that's what some scholars believe. And I would suggest perhaps it is called Bahrain, the two seas, because of the Sumerian myth of creation. It's where Abzu and Tiamat actually created the world. So to me, that would be my theory, but there's no way for me to prove it.
Anybody else who'd like to ask a question of clarification? Okay, I can't see. So now we can open the floor to questions to both of our presentations, presenters. Oh, sorry, I have something in the chat. Is that Hassan, Laura Hassan, would you like to ask a question? Is that?
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me? It wasn't me, it was a different Hassan.
Oh, okay, okay. All right, so if you like to ask a question, please choose the raise hand function. It's under participants.
Participants.
So, yes, okay, I see two. So Sama, Hannah, would you like to ask your question? And then we have Ida, and then we have Farhad.
Right, and thank you so much, both fascinating papers, very intellectually stimulating. My question goes to Georgina. Georgina, you told us about the signs performed by Jesus in the Gospel of John and how these signs were read by the immediate audience who witnessed these signs. My question is about how these signs have been read in the Quran. So the same signs, we have them represented in the Quran. A few more are added to them, like creating birds. So how do you look at the interpretation of the Quran of these signs? It's the same signs. In the Gospel of John, we read towards the end of the Gospel that these signs have been performed to tell us about who Jesus is, the Messiah, the Son of God. Same signs are in the Quran, but we see different interpretation. So how do you see that? Thank you.
Just firstly, perhaps if I can just ask what you mean with same signs, because certainly the Quran, although it has some of the miracle works of Jesus, like creating the clay birds and raising from the dead and healing, it's certainly, in terms of the Johannine signs, you know, creating a wine out of water and walking on water. So can I just ask what you mean with the same signs are in the Quran?
At least some of these signs, like healing the lepers, raising people from the dead, but the interpretation is different. So how do you see these different readings? We've got the same signifier, but the signifieds are different in the two different texts.
Yes, thank you. That's very helpful. So the signifier and the signified, and that's exactly the point I tried to make about narrative. So when you say these signs are in the Quran, there's no description of it where it would simply say Jesus, Isa, you know, he healed, he created. There's no narrative to explain how he did it or where or why. It's simply, in a sense, almost taken for granted, and so the content is alluded to, but it's for the reader or the listener to almost fill it with their own content, whatever is in their background knowledge, because the Quran doesn't make explicit to us what it's referring to when it says Jesus healed. Who did he heal? Where? For example. So what the Gospel of John does is provide a complete narrative setting. You know, Jesus went from Judea to Galilee, and it happened in Cana. You know, it's set in very particular geographical places, and so there's a whole the narrative of the Christ event, if you want to put it that way, or Jesus's life, is the substance of John's Gospel. Whereas for the Quran, it's taken as understood and applied in the Quran. But what is taken to be understood, that we're left having to now grasp at almost as 20th century readers, 21st century, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 4 people raising their hand, and next person is Ida.
Thank you. Thank you, both Georgina and Abdullah. Georgina's response takes me towards a question I want to actually ask of Abdullah. It's one thing to try and trace echoes of the canonical Gospels in the Quran, whether it's Sameh's suggestion that you have a number of the John signs that turn up in the Quran, although very briefly and in very different form. And you're suggesting similarly that there's echoes of this rich man and Lazarus parable that turn up in the Quran. What then happens if you go back and read the actual Gospels themselves? Is the Quran inviting you to go back and read the Gospels? If you do, what happens? So if you go back to read the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and even to read it in its context of all the other stuff around it in Luke's Gospel, which are other teaching and other parables that are pushing you, all of them, to think about how you're handling your money, how you're handling your life, how you're stewarding this life, if you like, in terms of the judgment to come and what's going to happen in the next life. There's a whole range of stuff in there, which I think chimes in with a lot of the Quranic concerns. But is there a gain for Muslims to go back and actually read it in that form in the Gospels? And for you personally, having done this journey to say, what are the echoes I can find of the rich man and Lazarus in the Quran, does that then give you more or less value to the actual parable as it sits there in Luke?
Thank you very much, Ida, for this question. And I would say the simple answer is yes. The Quran does invite people to go back into the Gospel, for example, or to the Bible, generally speaking, because we see many times that the Quran basically has allusions to the Hebrew Bible or to the New Testament. So the Quran appears to allude to different passages of the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. And basically, we can see also that sometimes the Quran, when it speaks to the Jews or to the Christians, it has these allusions which the audience would immediately understand. So its Jewish audience will understand what the Quran is trying to say. Its Christian audience will understand what the Quran is saying, because it has these allusions to the New Testament or to the Hebrew Bible, or sometimes even when to the rabbinic literature as well. So I would say yes, and the Quran not only implies that one should go back to the Bible. It doesn't just implies it, but it also explicitly expects it. There are, for example, a couple of passages in the Quran which, when it talks about the previous prophets, it says basically that, and if you don't know their stories, then ask the people of remembrance, Ahlul Dhikr, and the people of remembrance in those two passages where it's discussing it, it means it's the people of the book, the people, the Jews and the Christians. So if you don't know really the stories of those prophets, then go back and ask the people of the Bible, ask them to tell you about it. So the Quran doesn't just implicitly want you to go back, but it explicitly expects it from its audience.
So what does it do for your reading of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus? When you've read these allusions in the Quran and you go back into Luke's Gospel, what does it do for your reading of that parable?
Well, it basically, you could say it basically allows us to interpret the Quran in light of the, because if we do think that it is trying to parallel some of the motifs from the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, then we can perhaps better try to understand and interpret those passages in the Quran whenever we understand that there is this possible allusion to that parable.
But do you think that there's value then in reading that whole passage in Luke's Gospel other than in order to interpret the Quran? Does it have a value in its own right?
You mean regardless of the intertextuality between the Quran and the parable?
Yeah, I mean, apart from telling you how to interpret the Quran, does it take you anywhere by itself?
Sure, of course. I mean, so regardless of whether or not there is this kind of intertextuality between the Quran and the New Testament, it basically would tell us that, yes, go back. I mean, the Quran, of course, accepts the veracity of the Gospels, or of the Torah as well. So the Quran doesn't basically suggest otherwise, that to stay away, but expects you to believe in those scriptures that has come before the Quran. So even the Bible, regardless whether there was any kind of intertextuality between a specific passage and another, you could basically say that no Muslim would say that they're a Muslim if they don't believe in the Bible, because that's one of the pillars of faith in Islam, to believe in the previous books.
Okay, Ida, is that enough for this?
It'll do for now. Yeah.
Yes, great. So next one who has their hand up is Farhad, and then after that is Hassan, after that is Elizabeth, and after that is Steve. So if you could keep your comments short, and we can potentially have time for everybody, that would be great. Thank you. So yes, next person, Farhad.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My kind of question or comment is for Dr. Galadari. You know, in the discussion, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, there was the part that Lazarus, the rich man wants water from Lazarus or from people in heaven. And then in the Surah Al-Araf, you had the similar parable. Then, but among the verses you discussed, there was also, I think, verse 13, chapter 57. And then you discussed it in regard to the word of barzakh or barrier or stuff like that. But I read this in English. It says, so verse 13, chapter 57, it says, on the day when the hypocritical man and hypocritical woman will say unto those who believe, look on us that we may borrow from your light. It will say, go back and seek for light. Go back and seek for light. Then there will separate them a wall wherein is a gate, the inner side whereof contained mercy, while the outside thereof is toward the doom. So here is they requesting light, and then it told them go back effectively to the earth, get the light, and then but then effectively they left out in the dark. This is very similar. I mean, I want to see your opinion, because you refer to this verse and the example of the barzakh and the water, but this time is light. And this, remember the Matthew I think 20, Matthew, let's see what the chapter 25, 1 to 5, which is about the parable of the brides, 10 brides, which with the Jesus, which they come, they don't bring enough oil, and then 5 of them, the oil is finished when the bridegroom came, they don't have any oil, and then they're not led to the wedding, and they stay outside. And another feature I think is unique for me here, it's similar to me. I want to just your opinion, because kind of goes around the same topic. It is that the Quran talk about munafiqeen. So these are the believers which are looking for. And those bridesmaids, 5 of them were serious, and 5 of them wasn't as serious to keep enough oil. So I was thinking, do you see any parallel here too, or not?
Thank you very much, Farhad, for this question. And of course, yes, the motif of like the parable of the 10 virgins, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew about light. But not only that, I think even if you want to compare with the Gospel of John, in which Christ is basically symbolized by light, by life, and also by water. So perhaps water and light has even inner meanings than the exoteric meaning. So maybe the water that in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus is not just water to drink. It's not just the normal water. Maybe there is an inner meaning behind it, very much similar to how perhaps the Gospel of John understands the symbol of water. Same thing perhaps even in the Quran when it talks about, in chapter 7, when it talks about water, perhaps it's not just water for a drink, it's perhaps something beyond that. Maybe it is light, maybe it is life. And actually, it's interesting that the word munafiqun, which is usually understood and translated as hypocrites, the root meaning of the word nafaqa in Arabic actually means dead. So like a corpse is called like a nafaq. It's a dead corpse would be a nafaq. So nafaqa could also hold the meaning of death. So yes, there could be, of course, many other inner meanings that one could actually extrapolate from many of those.
Great. And Hassan, you're next. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, so I wasn't expected to be on video, so I'm not exactly presentable, but okay. Right, so my question was regards to Apsu and Tiamat, and I'm not sure if I fully understood the implications of what was being said, but I'd just like to say what I've understood of it with regards to the Quran and see if you share that view or if you disagree and how else I might think about it. So my understanding so far has been that the engagement of the Quran with ancient Near Eastern myths is primarily to demythologize them. And there's examples of this process. For example, the Quran omits the idea of the underworld. It omits a mythical cosmic ocean. And in terms of Apsu and Tiamat, it demythologizes those motifs as well. So do you see the engagement in the Quran with ancient Near Eastern myths basically the process of demythologization, or something more than that, or affirmation, or how do you see that engagement? Is my understanding of it to date valid, or do I need to reassess that? Thank you. Oh, by the way, thank you very much for the whole conference. Even just been absolutely, really, really terrific. Thank you so much for everybody participating and organizing. It's just been great. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Hassan, for this question. I honestly only brought up the idea of Abzu and Tiamat because biblical scholars find parallels between that and Genesis 1. And the only reason I brought it up is because in Genesis 1, we have this concept of two waters. The water below is separated from the water above. So there's the separation of waters. So I brought it up just because this perhaps is what the barzakh between the two seas is meant, where it's separating between two different waters, and not necessarily that those waters are touching each other. That's the only reason I brought up the concept of Abzu and Tiamat. I did not go deep into, honestly, those myths and its relationship with the Quran. I would think perhaps there might be some kind of relationship, if not directly, maybe indirectly. But I haven't really, honestly speaking, went deeply into that.
Sure, that's fine. I mean, to be honest, what really intrigued me, piqued my interest was particularly when you said as a idea of the creation of the world through the mixing of waters, and I thought, okay, now that's pure mythology. And how are you? Are you trying to make any implications from that in terms of creation stories? That was what piqued my interest, but clearly that was tangential. So, anyways, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan, for raising that question. Next person in the queue is Elizabeth. You can unmute yourself, please. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but I think I only have a few minutes. So I'll ask Georgina. Abdullah, I'll interact with you later. So Georgina, I was thinking about the idea of these signs as you were explaining them. And it occurred to me, whenever we interpret the Gospels, we have to think about the two layers of the Gospels, the life situation of Jesus, and then the life situation of the author, the evangelist, the narrator, whatever you choose to call him. And I was wondering, as you did your work, the understanding of the signs to the listeners or to the people that were experiencing Jesus' signs, the Jewish people at that time, and then this understanding of the signs as John would put them much later, after so many years, after really reflecting on who Jesus was. I wonder, do you think that John may have repurposed those signs in a way that his community would understand? Would this make a difference when you compare the understanding of signs within the Quran, now in those two levels, and then with the Quran? That's the question. I hope it's clear.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll try and give an explanation, and if the explanation is not on target, then maybe I just need to clarify something. I think Abdullah just said something that brought it together for me to a large extent. We often, and scholars of the Gospels have often given John a later date because of its seemingly more developed theology, and because it has this almost this way of assuming the synoptic Gospels and then repackaging it, if I may use such mundane language. However, if we look at the parables that Jesus tells as the establishment of the imagery, so when he's telling the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, he's using water in a particular way. When he's telling the parable of the 10 maidens and speaking of oil and light, he's telling these parables, and at the same time he's establishing natural elements as part of that sign system of the parables, on which John, with perhaps particular insight, could draw to extract these semaya, the 7 signs, around the imagery and the narrative that is established in the parables. So so in terms of your question about the separation between the synoptic Gospels and John, if one, I could almost see John as contemporary with the other synoptic Gospels, and I'm not a Johannine scholar, so I might be treading on hallowed ground here, but just with a different angle. We were talking about angles yesterday. Ida was in the example of her engagement ring and looking at things from different angles. John sees the parables and the imagery that is established in Jesus's ministry, this combination of his teaching and his work, from a particular angle that lets him select water, light, bread, vine, gate, shepherd as the pinpoints, you know, that pinpoints Jesus's ministry for him. But I wouldn't want to get into the historical dating of John. I hope that answered your whole question. Was there another part to it?
Just I was thinking more in terms of when Jesus was doing these signs, what did his the people around him understand them to be? And then when John wrote them down and put them within his narrative and then brought them to his audience in a way that his audience would understand, would there have been a difference in understanding, a difference in comprehending what these signs signified for John's audience as opposed to Jesus' audience? And perhaps, like you said, we can always discuss that.
Yeah. So, I mean, we certainly get the idea that throughout the Gospels, people are seeing Jesus as a miracle worker. So his reputation spreads beyond the boundaries within which he works. And that's why you have people like the centurion or the Syrophoenician woman who approach him for miracle work. But and of course, then those who are on the receiving end of healing will have a particular understanding. You know, the blind being healed will understand Jesus as a miracle worker, and some might then even take him to be a prophet. But what John does is to show how Jesus meets all of these expectations plus more. You know, he is the expected prophet, and that's where the author that I cited in my paper, Cho Suk Min, who designates, I think it's 5 prophets. You know, the prophet that was expected by the Samaritans, the Deuteronomic Messiah, the eschatological prophet. He meets all of those expectations, and yet he is more than that. Especially with the I am sayings, and as I said, I didn't deal with that in my paper. But the ego eimi, I am the vine, I am the bread. And so the audience of John is still in need of clarification, you know, so he still uses this methodology of there's misunderstanding, clarification, and belief. In each of the signs provides an opportunity for misunderstanding. How is Jesus bread? I'm the bread of life, and putting that together then with the understanding of what bread has been within the scriptures, to then provide clarification and hopefully belief. But at the same time, we also get an indication within John that not everybody is necessarily convinced.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for raising that question. It actually brings to the foreground some of our discussions about the world behind the text, which is like the world that Jesus was actually living in, and the world of the text, which we find in John's Gospel, and also the word in front of the text, which now you're adding nuance to it, because you're asking about the word in front of the text with regards to John's audience, but also with regards to us now reading John. And so there are intertwined categories here. I was just wondering, what would your own answer be to this question? I think we would really like to hear your own views as well, in conversation with Georgina's views.
Well, I don't really have an answer right now, but I definitely think John escalated the meanings of the signs because it pointed to more. Jesus is now the long-awaited for Messiah. He is the fulfillment of the temple. He is the fulfillment of the Jewish cultus. So everything has been magnified. But Jesus' audience did not understand it pre-resurrection. But post-resurrection, everything becomes magnified, and John is able to bring that understanding. So I agree with Georgina. Yeah.
Fascinating. So I think we can now move on to a question that Steve has. Steve, you can unmute yourself, please.
Yes, thank you, Georgina, for your presentation, and Abdullah as well. I just have a question. I'd like to kind of press our thinking about what ayat is, particularly in kind of an intertextual thought. I wanted to speak to the function of ayat as kind of proof of God's message to the prophet. I think Danny kind of alluded to that earlier. Have signs not been a proof of or a point of contention, sorry, between Christians and Muslims in regards to ijaz and to miracle, whether miracles are needed or not for proving the message, and then that then connects to kind of the biblical understanding of Simeon. These signs that we see in the Gospel of John as being miracles themselves. So if you could just speak to that a bit more, how does our understanding of ayat help us understand Simeon in the Gospel of John?
So thank you for that, Steve. The idea of, I mean, so on the one hand, what I'm trying not to do is to read Islamic tradition back into the Quran, but in a sense one can't get away from it also, because of course that is that is the context of the Quran. So the idea of the ayat as the proof of God's message, I think there's something in that developmental reading of ayat, you know, where initially it is within the shape of, and here I'm drawing very heavily on the studies of the Quran within late antiquity and Angelica Neuwirth's study of the oath clusters, and the formation of the early Meccan surahs that use an established divination practice. So it's using a form that is well known to the audience, but it's giving it new content. And so in that sense, then it's for that very early audience, that is the proof. I do consider the Islamic tradition that holds the literary production of the Quran in very high regard. That this is seen as, you know, it's the literary force, the linguistic force. And I know literary doesn't explain the genre. The Quran has its own unique genre, but it is the literary force of the Quran that is the proof for the Quran. It is the proof that it is God's message for the Quran. And hence I think is why almost the theology of the ayat, why every verse becomes known as an ayat, although that was not the initial signification of the word ayat, is exactly because of the linguistic force that you find. And that's another aspect that's really important, is considering the orality of the text, you know, the sound figures that it establishes. It's not just the conceptual images or the rational images that we have in our mind, but the sound figures that are established through the form of the Quran. And so I think initially ayat is really about form, which then later on you get this, the technical term almost becomes a stand-in for this huge corpus of images and figures that we get early on. I hope that helps a bit.
Thank you, Georgina. Before we go to our next question, which is asked by Danny, just reading a couple of comments here. Carol is saying, on misunderstanding of signs in John's Gospel, it is interesting that there is acknowledgement in the text that the disciples did not understand until Jesus rose from the dead. And then Ida says, maybe one difference between Jesus' audience and John's audience is the loss of the temple and Jerusalem. So the signs for them would be of life without the temple and beyond the temple. Okay. So now, Danny.
Yes, this is a fabulously rich session. So thank you both, Georgina and Abdullah. It's been fabulous. The whole conference has, of course. I'm wanting to ask Abdullah a question, and talking about the barriers. And the one thing that strikes me about the Quranic barriers is they're a little bit more interesting. You know, the barrier in Al-Hadid has got a gate in it, and I wonder what that gate is for. And then the barrier in Al-Araf has a viewing platform on it. And I think it's quite discussed whether the people sitting on the viewing platform are really good guys who know everything, or actually guys who are not quite made it yet and they're going to make it once they make up their minds, or something like that. But so I just, this concept of barrier, which I thought was very rich, it seems to me the Quran's got well, better barriers, different kind of barriers. So is that, I mean, you inspired me to think this thought. Can you take it further, Abdullah?
Well, thank you very much, Danny, for this question. Yes, indeed, the Quran has a little bit more descriptions about this barrier. And that is why I think that the Quran is not using directly from the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, but is most likely using other late antiquity traditions that perhaps use the parable as its subtext, or some motifs of it as its subtext. So yes, as you said, it's a more interesting kind of barrier. There is a door in Quran 57 for that barrier. And as you said, yes, in Quran 7, that barrier has a place where people can watch over both sides of that barrier. And within Islamic tradition, there has been so many different ideas and theories behind what exactly is this barrier, and is there really something else that the Quran is trying to say. Like, for example, if we look into Ibn Arabi, he goes into a very deep way to say that this barrier is actually talking about people, the people of the barrier in Quran 7, for example, who can see both sides, because they're basically looking into, they are the ones who are living in the barzakh. And his idea of the barzakh is not really the abode of the dead, but his idea of the barzakh is basically the place or the location where the two seas meet. And Ibn Arabi simply says, well, the two seas meet is not simply just the salty water and this sweet water, but it's the two types of knowledge. There is the exoteric knowledge and the esoteric knowledge. That's what those two seas are, according to Ibn Arabi. And the people who are of the barzakh, who are watching on both sides, or watching both sides, they're the ones who would be able to realize the exoteric knowledge as well as the esoteric knowledge. And he uses basically Quran 18, which is Surah Al-Kahf, the chapter of the cave, which talks about two seas. The passages don't really talk about what two seas they are, but it talks about Moses seeking a person where those two seas merge. And from that, he has these kinds of intertextualities in which he believes that it's pretty much two types of knowledge and so forth. So it's a fascinating thing. And if you look into the Muslim tradition, there's so many different theories behind what this is. And that is why, as I said, there is no consensus amongst Muslim scholars on what exactly is this barrier.
Thank you. We have a few more questions, and we're running towards the end of our session, so it would be great if we can cover all the questions. The next person is Kendra. Kendra, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
We can, but we can't see you. If you could start your video, if possible, that would be great.
Okay, it's working on it. Thank you both. These presentations were wonderful. Really enjoyed them. Georgina, I was thinking about, you mentioned several passages from the Quran, and this is kind of a side note question, but one of the passages you mentioned is, those who repulse the orphan and deny food to the needy, they deny the day of judgment. And that immediately sent me to think about the parable where Jesus talks about, you know, when you gave food to the hungry or gave water to the thirsty, then you did it for me. And it's also in the context of day of judgment things. And then there's also, you mentioned from Surah 58, God heard the words of the woman who disputed with the prophet about her husband, complained to God. And my mind immediately went to the parable of the woman and the unjust judge in the New Testament. And I was wondering, were you also thinking of those parallels? Is that something that you'd like to explore? Especially Esther, Abdullah had mentioned that there's so many of the parables are referenced or seem to be, the Quran seems to be familiar with them.
Thank you very much. I wouldn't want to suggest that all of these are necessarily intertextual in the sense that there's a direct relationship between these texts and the Bible, because in and of themselves, you know, the idea of feeding the needy is not, it's not necessarily a biblical concept. It's a general human ethical concept, one could perhaps say. So it doesn't need that direct, it's not, you know, it's not linked to any particular biblical text or law in a direct enough way for me to say that there is definite intertextuality. Of course, the ethical implications in there, I agree with you fully. The interesting thing for me is that the one who does that is not a rejecter of God. It's the person who does that is a rejecter of the day of judgment. So as assuming that they will not be held accountable. Now, and once again, the day of judgment is not necessarily unique to the Christian tradition or to the Jewish Judeo-Christian tradition as such. And then once again with the Surah 58 with the woman who disputes, I think I didn't draw any further references from it. It's placed within a context of a divorce practice that is so particular to that context, the practice of zihar, sorry, which is explained as a man breaking relations with his wife, but not divorcing, which is a very, I looked at other ancient Near Eastern texts to see if there was anything similar, any divorce formula similar. This idea, it's explained in Islamic tradition as a husband saying to his wife, "You are to me as my mother's back," which of course places the wife then in the category of those who are unlawful to the husband. And yeah, it's so particular that once again, even though we have this almost a trope of a woman who complains for the sake of justice, I mean, personally, I connected it more to the Syro-Phoenician woman who argued with Jesus about the crumbs under the table. So there are resonances, but I don't see a direct borrowing, if I can use that term, between those two texts. But you're right that there are definite resonances between the texts.
Thank you. And I hadn't had time to look up the full context of those verses, those surahs either, so appreciate it.
Thank you both. So if I could just use my privilege as a chair to tag on the back of that question. There was a question I had from the very beginning of this session, burning to ask, but is actually more of a clarification question, and it's more directed to Abdullah. But I think it has importance for our whole academic discourse when talking about intertextual analysis of the text. So my question is a question to do with authorship and agency within the scripture that we're talking about. Abdullah, a few times you mentioned that the Quran quotes or uses, the Quran uses, or the Quran quotes even verbatim some text that has appeared in previous writings and scripture. And then my question is that of course, you also mentioned that there are some explicit referrals that says, this has appeared in your own stories, and that is quite well and fine in that context. But when we are talking about similarities or parallels between stories, or shared, what I personally call them shared sacred narratives, then I take issue with a certain discourse that refers to the Quran as using or as quoting necessarily, because it immediately establishes a hierarchical relationship between scripture. And one of my solution is that if instead of the Quran we put God, and you say, for example, God uses the story, then it immediately sounds a bit more awkward for us, especially as Muslims that believe that the Quran is the direct word of God, and the source of the knowledge is one. So this question for me gains more importance when we talk about reading the other text in its own terms, or respecting. How can we, build a discourse around it that gives agency to the scriptures that we are reading, and not, creating this sort of hierarchical relationship between the two scriptures?
Thank you, Shirin, for this comment. Basically, in the past, for example, many Western scholars have used the term borrowing, that the Quran is borrowing and things like that. And I'm happy to see that the vast majority of Western scholars have moved away from that kind of term and more into terms such as engaging with. And I don't think it necessarily, like when we're saying that the Quran like alludes to or quotes or something like that, it doesn't necessarily must be understood as a hierarchical thing, but it's more of a chronological thing. So the Gospels, for example, they sometimes allude to the Hebrew Bible, and it's just a chronological thing. It's not showing necessarily some kind of a hierarchy between them. And the same thing I would think perhaps with the Quran. So the Quran, when it's alluding to certain parts of the Gospel or certain parts of the Hebrew Bible, it's an allusion so that the audience would be able to refer to and understand. Perhaps some of its audience would immediately understand, oh, so that's what it's referring to. So now we know what it is. So it's in that sense. It doesn't necessarily mean it is borrowing, as some of the earlier Western scholars used to use.
Yes, I totally understand. I mean, just taking it back to Quran 7:44-51, I actually looked at it again during this session to see that if actually the Quran, I mean, you mentioned it quotes, from the similar, something that has appeared in previous literature. And when I looked at the story again, it didn't seem that it was a quotation. It was just a telling of the story. And I was wondering, that terminology of quoting, can we ascribe that to the author of the Quran, which is essentially God, and saying, I mean, if for God to, let's say, for example, you have written 2 books, Abdullah, for example, and then if you use the same concepts or methodology in your second book, you are not necessarily quoting from your previous book, even though you may be alluding or you may be referring readers to your previous work, but you are not at that moment taking material from your other work, you're just using it again, if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes sense. But by the way, just to clarify something, when I said a quotation which is almost verbatim, it's not from Quran 7:44-51, which is taking some motifs of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, but it's actually from Quran 7:40, which talks about the camel passing through the eye of the needle. That is what seems to be almost verbatim. As a quotation, it's almost verbatim. So that's what I meant. It's from 7:40.
Thank you. We have two more hands up, and one is Johan and the other one is Farhad. Farhad has mentioned his comment in the chat box, so I'm just gonna go and give the floor to Johan to ask his question, and we have 3 minutes. Thank you, Johan. Go ahead.
Well, 3 minutes is ample for what I want to say. In the first day, Ida showed us the picture of the Chinese wall as a divide. And actually, Abdullah said there was one of the root words that related to heights. Now, of course, Dani, the Chinese wall allows you a gate and a platform to look on both sides. So it all makes sense. It all comes together. And for me as a Dutchman, it is even more sense because we make dikes in the sea so that we separate the salt and the sweet, you see. So it all makes sense. It all makes sense.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Johan. I think we have 2 minutes to go to Farhad as well.
Hi, sorry, I was.
And just before Farhad makes his comment, we need to stop at 4 o'clock promptly, so we have a really little time. And can people arrive a bit early for the next session so we can put them in groups? So please do arrive at the very least 5 minutes early, but even if you're there 8 minutes earlier, that's even better. And Farhad, we have 60 seconds. I feel like I'm a BBC anchor now, trying to get a sound bite from one of our interviews. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I can talk fast usually, but you know, my question is related to the Dr. Jardim's talk about, and the questions about what is the Quran, verse means Quran, and then whether the meaning of the verses, ayat came, when can, you know, there is a crucial verse which Quran says, so soon we will show them our signs in the furthest regions of the earth and in their own souls until it becomes manifest to them that is the truth. It is not enough that thy Lord doth witness all things. Effectively, it says the signs you can see in the horizons, you can see the signs in yourself. So and then, you know, the books, the verses of the Quran also signs. Essentially, everything is created a sign of God. That's their understanding, not necessarily the proof, because everything is created by him and somehow is related to him. And then its act of creation is the word, because it says he created, usually the Quran has this phrase, when we want to create something, we say be and it is. So the word, the act of saying is kind of the act of creativity. And this is also related to Jesus, because Jesus in Quran is called a word of God. I know this is difference in Christianity, is the word of God. So all come together, you know, active creativity is like saying a word, and an ayat represents all the creation, and then you can categorize them. Okay, the book also is the signs from him, the verses, everything in nature is the sign of God, and whatever you experience yourself is also a sign of God.
Thank you, Farhad. I take that as a comment more than a question, right?
Yes,
more or less.
I want to thank Farhad for that, because thank you for the reminder of the act of creativity in the word. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. On that beautiful last note, I'd like to thank our two presenters one more time. Thank you so much, and for all the people who asked questions and engaged in the discussion. It was really wonderful. And we will see you 10 minutes to 5 in the exchange room, in the waiting room.
No,
Thank you.
The next session starts at 4:30. We have a half
4:30. Oh, sorry. Yes. Thank you, Ida. Yes, 4:30. So please be back in 20 minutes time. Because we have different time zones, so I just say, please be back in 20 minutes time, according to your own watch. Thank you and goodbye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Georgina, I did notice, I thought in one of your slides, there was a typing error in the Quranic
Oh, that's quite possible.
quotation. Yeah. All right. Okay. As long as you're aware.
It was all